Produced by Bettany Hughes. It's presented by the Hindustan Times. Since we're a little early, I'm going to pass it over to Bettany to begin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you all hear me? No? Can we have the mics still raised a bit, please? I'll carry on talking. Hello, can you hear me now? Yes? No? There's frantic fiddling going on.
Hello. 8, 7.
Hello. Can you hear Tom?
Testing. Hello.
I think this is a patriarchal ploy to reduce my voice.
Better believe it.
So good afternoon, everybody. It's entirely lovely to see so many of you here. It's even lovelier to see you here if you have your mobile phones switched off. If you don't, why don't you go outside and take a phone? Well, yes, that includes you, Tom. But it's a complete delight. It's a real honour for me to be here. I am, I'd say, a friend of Tom's, but also a huge admirer of his. And I think it really befits the calibre and charisma of this festival that these sessions endeavour to travel in both space and time through sharing ideas. And that might sound like a ridiculously ambitious notion, but I honestly think that you are about to spend an hour in the company of both a subject and an author who are master in the arts of that questing. Tom Holland is an award-winning author and historian. He won the Runciman Award for his book Persian Fire. He won the, he was shortlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize, very prestigious prize, and he won prizes for Rubicon as well. But I think that he would admit to you that probably the greatest achievement of his life is not only to play cricket on the Lord's cricket pitch, but also to take 3 wickets at Lord's. So ladies and gentlemen, a hand for that. When he's not focusing on his cricket career, he has time for sort of minor intellectual pursuits, and he was obviously bored one day and decided that he should do a new translation of the works of Herodotus, the 5th century BC author who is known as the father of history, which is something that he accomplished together with Professor Paul Cartledge of Cambridge University. And this is what he is going to speak to you about today. I should just say that Tom is a clever boy, and he's also a great fan of the art of inquiry, so please do interrogate him afterwards. So be thinking of your questions as he speaks to you for a little bit. Tom Holland.
Can you all hear me? Is this, no? Is that better? Higher? Can it go higher? Is that good? You can hear me now? Is that okay? Okay, is that loud enough? Yes, good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Bettany, for mentioning my cricket career. I always like to revel in that. And it's an absolute joy to be back in Jaipur, where I once bowled the Crown Prince of Udaipur. I thought I'd get that in as well. And the fact that there are so many authors, not just from India, but from across the world, speaks, I think, of the fascination that India holds for writers from everywhere. But that fascination with India, that sense of it as a glimmering land, not just of beauty, but of wonder, is a very ancient one. It does not begin with modern Europeans. It doesn't begin with the British or the French or the Dutch. It doesn't begin with Vasco da Gama. It doesn't even begin with the Romans. It doesn't begin with the Macedonians of Alexander the Great. It in fact begins with the man that I'm going to talk about today, the father of history, as he's called and as this talk is titled, but also, it's a minor detail but an important one, bearing in mind where we are. He is also the father of foreigners writing about India and getting it wrong. This is what Herodotus has to say about the people who live in India. It is the Indians who live the furthest east and the closest to the rising of the sun. East of them, there stretches nothing but a wilderness of sand, which obviously puts the Chinese absolutely in their place. Herodotus describes a land where the trees grow wool, where there are tribes of people whose ears reach to the ground. There is one tribe that mate in public, and whenever any of them fall ill, instead of trying to cure them, they kill them and then eat them. However, among all this remarkably inaccurate detail, there are occasional glimmerings of things that are clearly true. For instance, he describes a tribe of Indians who are vegetarian and who are determined never to kill a single living thing. And there's a sort of fascinating glimpse there of trends in Indian culture that, of course, will turn out to be incredibly important. And it's that completely inimitable blend of extraordinarily fantastical detail, the kind of thing that you might get in a magical realist novel, almost sort of Salman Rushdie-esque, if I'm allowed to mention his name here, with all kinds of details that are true, that essentially explain why, ever since I was 12, Herodotus has been for me by miles my favourite author. And he's a favourite. He's a classic because he's the kind of writer who can evolve as you get older. So the Herodotus that I admire and love now is not the Herodotus that I loved when I was 12. The reason that I read him when I was 12 was very simply that I had got gripped by a story that, in my opinion, is the most thrilling, not just in ancient history, but in the entire span of history. It's the account of the Persian invasion of Greece. Persia at that time was the undisputed superpower, the big gorilla in the global jungle. And its borders spread all the way east to India and all the way west to the Aegean. And the great kings took for granted that it was their God-given right to bring the whole world under the aegis of Ahura Mazda, the Lord of truth and order. And so they were determined to stamp out what they regarded as a fractious nest of terrorists in mountainous terrain across the Aegean in what we would now call mainland Greece. And to that end, a great king named Darius sent an expedition to destroy the city of Athens. The Athenians marched out and thrillingly, heroically confronted the far larger Persian army at the plain of Marathon and defeated them. 10 years later, Darius' son Xerxes led an enormous task force in person. It was so huge, Herodotus tells us, that as it passed through Greece, the army drank rivers dry. This army was briefly held up by a tiny band of Greeks led by 300 Spartans and their king Leonidas. It held out, this tiny, tiny task force held out for 2.5 days before being wiped out. However, the fight went on. The Persians occupied Athens, burnt it. The Athenians had retreated to their ships. They could watch fire rising from their burning city. But a few days later, they and other Greek contingents in the Greek fleet defeated the Persian fleet. A year later, at the Battle of Plataea, a land battle, the Greeks definitively ended the Persian invasion. And it was, in their opinion, the greatest, the most extraordinary, the most stunning victory of all time. They went on and on about it ever since. I absolutely shared their sense that this was a complete thriller. And to me, it was the way that it was cast, it was essentially Lord of the Rings only true. An evil empire coming out of the East and being defeated against all the odds by the heroes of the West. And that was absolutely how I understood it. I sort of basically absorbed this Greek propaganda. And I became so obsessed by it that I began to realize, this is my 12-year-old self, that I was actually, if I wanted to know more about it, I was actually going to have to go and read Herodotus, who was our main source for this extraordinary conflict. And I was quite intimidated at that prospect. I'd never actually read a classic. By classic, I had never read Jane Austen or Dickens or anyone. And to go and actually read a proper, real-life ancient Greek, I was sort of kind of intimidated. And I went to the library, and the version that I took out came in 2 volumes, which in itself was quite sort of intimidating. A book that was so long it had to come in 2 volumes. I'd never read anything that long. Took them home, began reading. And the opening sentence, so this is the first line of the first work of history ever written, seemed to me hugely promising. Herodotus from Halicarnassus here displays his inquiries, that human achievement may be spared the ravages of time, and that everything great and astounding, and all the glory of those exploits which serve to display Greeks and barbarians alike to such effect, be kept alive, and additionally, and most importantly, to give the reason they went to war. And I thought, brilliant, war, that's what I want, bring it on. So I carried on reading, and was rather puzzled to find myself reading a story about a guy, a king, who is so obsessed by his wife's beauty that he wants his bodyguard to see her naked. And Herodotus tells us that the measure of this man, of this king's insanity, was that he really fancied his wife, which I sort of found a fascinating glimpse into the strangeness of the age. Anyway, so the bodyguard is persuaded to watch the queen naked, and this being a Greek story, it all ends up horribly. The king ends up dead, and the bodyguard ends up the new king. And I thought, well, that's all very well, but please can we cut to the chase and get to the Battle of Marathon? Well, a few pages on, and I'm reading a story about a guy who, he plays the lyre, and he's the great musician of his day. And rather like in Britain, artists go to America to make it big, so the Beatles or Take That, people like that. So he goes to Sicily, and he makes an enormous splash, coins it in, packs up his cash, puts it on a ship to go back to Corinth, his home. Only the people who are manning the ship turn out to be pirates, and they're going to grab this poor guy's loot. They make him walk the plank. He stands on the end of the plank, plucks his lyre, sings one last song, jumps into the sea, and lo and behold, the nick of time, up swims a dolphin. The guy lands on the back of the dolphin, and the dolphin takes him to Corinth. And again, I was thinking, well, this is odd. This isn't what I was expecting at all. And it goes on and on like this. And essentially, Herodotus cannot stay on piste. The moment there's an opportunity for a digression, he will take it. And the best example of all this is where finally I'd got to an account of the Persians. Cyrus, the first great Persian king who establishes the empire. Herodotus tells us all about his exploits, and then he describes his death. Tells us about his son Cambyses, who leads the invasion of Egypt. The Persians under Cambyses conquer Egypt. But before Herodotus can get onto this narrative, he has to say, before I tell you about the invasion of Egypt, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Egypt itself, because it's very interesting. And when Herodotus says a little bit about Egypt, ladies and gentlemen, that's how much he means. 200 pages, which of course is fascinating, but when you're gagging to get to the story of the Persian Wars, it was all very frustrating. And I read through the whole of the first volume of Herodotus, and still I hadn't got to the Battle of Marathon. But then I came to volume 2, and I have to say the wait was completely worth it. When Herodotus begins his narrative of the Persian Wars, it's completely thrilling, it's completely exciting, it's completely gripping, and it was everything I'd been hoping for. I'm going to read you just a very brief passage to give you a flavor of the excitement. And it comes from Herodotus' account of the Battle of Thermopylae, where the Spartans under their king Leonidas held out. It's the subject of a fairly, well, let's say opinions vary on it, Hollywood film called 300, which draws on Herodotus, loosely, I think it's fair to say. And this describes the final stand of the Spartans. Xerxes, the Persian king, has sent a crack squad of heavy infantry to go up round the mountain pass and to come down in the Spartans' rear. And so they know that, that all is doomed. Xerxes, who had greeted the sun by performing libations, then delayed launching his offensive until it was roughly the time in the morning when market squares fill up. Ephialtes, who's the traitor, the Greek traitor who has revealed the existence of the path around the back of the mountains, had told him that he needed to wait only until then because the route down from the mountain was more direct and took far less time than the ascent and the circuit of it. As Xerxes and the barbarians under him moved to the attack, so did Leonidas and his Greeks. Indeed, conscious that they were going out to their deaths, they advanced much deeper into the open stretch of the pass than they had done at first. While on previous days they had stood sentry behind the line of the wall and made sallies only out into the narrow reaches of the pass, now they joined battle beyond the narrows, where the barbarians suffered massive casualties. This was due to their officers, who wielded whips and would lash all the men in their respective regiments, urging them ever onwards to the front. There were many also who fell into the sea and were drowned, and even more who were trampled underfoot by their comrades while still alive. Indeed, there was no counting how many perished. The Greeks, you see, because they knew that they were going to die at the hands of the men coming round the mountain, did all they could to demonstrate to the barbarians the full force of their strength, and fought in a frenzy, without regard for their lives. Now by this stage, because most of them had smashed their spears to splinters, they were using their swords to slaughter the Persians. The man who proved himself without peer in the struggle was Leonidas, but then he fell, and with him other celebrated Spartiates too, whose name, as men who well merit commemoration, I have made sure to learn. 2 of Xerxes' brothers also fell in the battle, which raged furiously over the corpse of Leonidas, Persian against Lacedaemonian, until by sheer force of courage the Greeks managed to grab hold of the body and send their adversaries reeling back 4 times. This contest continued until the soldiers arrived with Ephialtes, at which point, as the Greeks became aware of their coming, the whole character of the fighting changed. The Greeks withdrew back past the wall to where the road was narrow, and there, all of them except for the Thebans, banded together and took up a position on a hillock. On this hillock, which was located in the entrance to the pass where the stone lion commemorating Leonidas now stands, they defended themselves with daggers, if they still had them, or else with their fists and teeth. Meanwhile, the barbarians buried them beneath a hail of missiles, pulling down the defensive wall and attacking them head-on, with those who had come round the mountain, completing the encirclement. So, gripping, visceral stuff. And pretty much what I'd been hoping for. But I said that my understanding of Herodotus and the values and the qualities that he represented evolved as I grew up. And what I came to realize as I continued to study this extraordinary writer was that actually he was not remotely a Greek chauvinist. Now you might be led to think from the description of the Persians being lashed and forced to fight, forced to go and engage the Spartans, that Herodotus regards them as cowards. But not a bit of it. If you read the whole histories, you realize that actually Herodotus has a huge respect, not just for the Persians, but for pretty much everyone that he comes across. Because actually the motor for what Herodotus is doing is not simply to tell the story of the war, but to try and make sense of the world in which he lives and to try and understand the immense variety of different cultures and civilizations and faiths and gods and habits that render the sweep of humanity so fascinating to him. And I mentioned the invasion of Egypt by Cambyses, the son of Cyrus. Herodotus takes it for granted because he's been told as much by the Egyptian priests that he's gone to talk to. The Egyptian priests tell him that Cambyses was mad. And the evidence for Cambyses being mad was that he did not show any respect for the gods of the Egyptians. Cambyses would go into the temples in Egypt and he would see that there were statues there of gods with animal heads, and he'd burst out laughing at the sight. When he is told that a god in the form of a bull has appeared in Egypt, Cambyses' response is to take his bow and arrow and go and shoot it. And to Herodotus, this behavior is utterly repugnant. And the reason for that is given in a passage that, for me, sums up what is most humane and admirable about Herodotus, and makes him, I think, a writer perfectly suited, actually, to this globalized world that we live in the 21st century. So I'll just read this passage. I think it's one of the most remarkable passages in the whole corpus of ancient literature. So this is Herodotus talking about why he thinks Cambyses was mad. Everywhere you look, it seems to me, the evidence accumulates that Cambyses was utterly deranged. For why otherwise would he have mocked what to others were hallowed customs? Just suppose that someone proposed to the entirety of mankind that a selection of the very best practices be made from the sum of human custom. Each group of people, after carefully sifting through the customs of other peoples, would surely choose its own. Everyone believes his own customs to be far and away the best. From this it follows that only a madman would think to jeer at such matters. Indeed, there is a huge amount of corroborating evidence to support the conclusion that this attitude to one's own native customs is universal. Take, for example, this story from the reign of Darius. He called together some Greeks who were present and asked them how much money they would wish to be paid to devour the corpses of their fathers, to which the Greeks replied that no amount of money would suffice for that. Now Darius summoned some Indians called Calantians, who do eat their parents, and asked them in the presence of the Greeks how much money it would take to buy their consent to the cremation of their dead fathers, at which the Calantians cried out in horror and told him that his words were a desecration of silence. Such, then, is how custom operates, and how right the poet Pindar is, it seems to me, when he declares in his poetry that custom is the king of all. Now, what's extraordinary about that poem, about that passage, is that Herodotus has chosen Darius, the king of the Persians, who sent the expedition to destroy Athens that was defeated at Marathon. He has chosen this king to serve as the moral fulcrum of the anecdote. And the reason that Darius summons Greeks who burn their parents and the Calantians, the Indian tribe, Herodotus says, who eat their parents, is that these are the people who exist on the western and the eastern margins of the Persian world. So from the perspective of the Persians, it is the Greeks and the Indians who are the barbarians, the foreigners. And what Herodotus has done is to think himself into the mind of a Persian. And it's something that many Greeks could not forgive him for. He was labelled a Philobarbarus, which is sort of a barbarian lover, a bleeding heart liberal, the closest that Greek comes to that phrase. But to us, I think it marks him out as someone who is phenomenally ahead of his time. And I think it is really striking that he is content to praise the courage and the fortitude, but also the moral structures that govern the world of Persia, this empire that within Herodotus' own lifetime had attempted to conquer the cities of his people. Herodotus is terribly taken, for instance, with the Persian education system, which is very simple. He says they only ever teach three things. They teach their children how to ride, how to shoot the bow and arrow, and how to tell the truth. And Herodotus says that's basically all you need to know. You don't need to know programming, just how to ride a horse, shoot, and tell the truth. And even Xerxes, the king who leads the army that wipes out the Spartans at Thermopylae, even Xerxes is described by Herodotus repeatedly in terms of some admiration. He says that of all the men in the Persian army, all the many millions, there was none more fitted to lead it than Xerxes. And there's one particularly wonderful passage where Xerxes has arrived on the shores of the Hellespont, the strip of water that separates what's now Turkey from the European section, so Asia Minor from Europe. And he's bridged it with a series of boats, 2 pontoon bridges. And he has all his forces stretched out before him, and he has all his fleets. And he sits there and he enjoys the spectacle. So he's and he's at Abydos, which is on the shores of the Hellespont. And Xerxes, once in Abydos, wished to review his entire task force. A dais of white stone, built beforehand by the people of Abydos on the orders of the king himself, had already been raised on a hill expressly for him. And Xerxes, as he sat and gazed down from this vantage point onto the shore, and beheld both his land forces and his fleet, had a longing to see the ships compete in a race. This contest, when it was duly staged, was won by the Phoenicians from Sidon. And Xerxes was delighted by the sport, and indeed by his entire task force. It was then, at the sight of the Hellespont, completely covered by his ships, and the entire shoreline and plain of Abydos filled up with his men, that Xerxes considered himself blessed, and afterwards began to weep. When Artabanus, his uncle, and the man who initially had freely broadcast his opposition to the invasion of Greece and advised Xerxes against it, saw that his nephew was in tears, he inquired as to the reason. "What a difference, O king, between your behavior now and that of only a short time before. Then you considered yourself blessed. Now you weep." "Yes," Xerxes answered, "for I was musing on how short is human life, and the pity of it pierced me through. All these multitudes here, and yet in 100 years' time, not one of them will be alive." Now, it's great, isn't it? It's really great. I have no doubt that Xerxes did not say that. I'd be very surprised if he did cry. But the thing, and the reason that I'm fairly sure that Xerxes didn't say that is it doesn't correspond to anything that a Persian would have said. It's an entirely Greek sentiment. That idea that when you are most happy with your greatness, that is when Nemesis will threaten. And of course, that is, in a sense, the entire moral impact of Herodotus' account of the invasion, that all this greatness, all these multitudes of men and ships will end up destroyed. And it's a tragic perspective. But Herodotus, by giving that tragic perspective, that moment, that fleeting moment of self-awareness to Xerxes, is very deliberately dignifying him. It's a very moving moment, I think. So, although Herodotus inevitably is a man of his background, inevitably he is a Greek, he brings Greek presumptions, he brings Greek standards of behavior. What marks his history and what makes it so compulsively readable and makes Herodotus himself such a delightful companion is that he is insatiably curious about everything that he comes across. And in that curiosity, there is something that the world today lives with, which is a desire to understand and to record the world as it actually is. And Herodotus is absolutely at the cutting edge of this. And the reason that he's called the father of history is that he is the first person to argue that events that happened in the past have a value for their own sake. That they're significant not because they demonstrate the will of God or the pattern of human behavior per se, but because they are worthy of being recorded. And that really is the first spark of the fire that will become the historical spirit. And what is, I think, for anyone who is interested in history, what is wonderful and moving when you read through Herodotus' account are those moments where he lets you in on his methodology. and you see how history, it's like watching the process of gestation. You see history being born. Now, often the effect is very, very peculiar. For instance, Herodotus tells us about the death of a Spartan king called Cleomenes, the father-in-law of Leonidas, who died at Thermopylae. And Herodotus freely says we don't really know what happened. Cleomenes had gone mad. He'd been locked up in a hut with a slave. Cleomenes, it is said, had asked this slave for a knife. The slave had given Cleomenes the knife and then left him alone. In the morning, when people went in to find Cleomenes, they discovered that he had hacked himself to death. And he'd done this, first of all, by scraping the flesh off his feet, then off his ankles, then off his calves, then he'd sliced off strips of flesh off his thighs, he'd then mutilated his groin, he'd then pulled out his guts, and at this point, understandably, he had died. And Herodotus says, but it's a mystery why this happened. Which god had Cleomenes offended that this fate had been visited on him? The Athenians say that he had burnt down a grove. The Argives say that he had attacked them while they were under truce. The Delphians say that he hadn't shown sufficient respect to the oracle, and so he goes on. Now, what's admirable is that Herodotus is portraying the ray of information. He's talked to all these different people. He's got these sort of different sources. He can't make his mind up, so he's laying it out for the reader to make, to decide. What, of course, Herodotus at no point even contemplates is the possibility that this guy who supposedly had committed suicide might have been murdered. It simply doesn't cross his mind. But you see there, he goes so far, but not quite enough. But then there are other places within the histories where you think, yes, this is exactly like history as it's done now. And when you watch a TV program about, say, 20th century history, and you watch people who have lived through great events, and you hear them talking about it, we take that for granted. But there's an incredible passage in Herodotus where he's talking about the Battle of Plataea, the great land battle that finished the Persian invasion. And it's as though a shiver goes down the spine, because what Herodotus is doing, he interviews someone who had spoken to someone who'd fought at that battle. It's a man called Thersander of Orchomenus. And Thersander had been in the city of Thebes, which had sided with the Persians, and on the evening before the battle, the Persian commander had summoned the Thebans and the Persians to have a great feast together. And Herodotus tells us what Thersander had told him about that feast. The following story I heard from Thersander of Orchomenus, a man of the highest reputation in his own city. Thersander told me that he was invited to the banquet, together with 50 men from Thebes, and that the Thebans and the Persians, rather than being kept apart, were instead placed together, one Theban and one Persian to every couch. After the meal was over, they continued drinking, and the Persian who was sharing Thersander's couch asked him in Greek where he came from. Then the Persian said, "Now that we have shared a table and poured a libation from the same cup, I would like to leave you with memorials of my thoughts. In that way, your eyes will be opened to what is coming, and you will be able to plan ahead with your own best interests in mind. Just look at these Persians, busy with their banqueting, and gaze upon the army we left camped out along the river. So many to see, and yet in just a short time, only a fraction of them will survive." And even as the Persian said this, the tears poured down his cheeks. Thersander, nonplussed by his comments, asked him, "Should you not be mentioning this to the commander and to the Persians with him who are particularly well regarded?" "No, my friend," he answered. "There is nothing any man can do to avert what the god has decreed. Even if you speak entirely reliably, no one ever wants to believe you. Plenty of Persians have grasped how things stand, but necessity has us fettered, and so we must follow. Of all the miseries to which men are prey, this is the most hateful, to understand something fully, but be impotent to effect it," something with which I'm sure we can all agree. And all this I heard from Thersander of Orchomenus, and he told me too that he informed people about it then and there, well before the battle came to be fought, at Plataea. Now again, there are echoes in what that Persian says about, you know, we're doomed, we have this great army, but it's going to be wiped out, that is clearly, it's a Greek perspective. But I think the emphasis that Herodotus gives to this, the way that he rams it home, the way he says that Phasander had spoken to people at the time, suggests that Herodotus believed him, and that this information, the sense of pessimism that a Persian had expressed on the eve of a battle in 479 BC, so 2,500 years ago, was accurate. And that is an extraordinary thing. 2,500 years ago. And we can be fairly confident we know what at least one individual participant in that battle felt. As I say, whenever I read that, I feel the shiver down the spine. And this urge, not just to research, to explain, but to justify his researches and his explanations, is a feature of what makes Herodotus so fascinating. He is happy to put down things in his history that he's been told that he doesn't necessarily believe. There's one famous case where, even as he says he doesn't believe what he's being told, he reveals that in fact it's true. And he's talking about the Phoenicians, people who lived in various cities dotted along the coast of what's now Lebanon. And the Phoenicians have been commissioned by an Egyptian pharaoh to sail round the continent of Africa, what the Greeks call Libya. And it is said that the Phoenicians had sailed all the way around Africa and come through the Straits of Gibraltar, through the Mediterranean, back to Egypt. And Herodotus says this is absolutely ridiculous. He doesn't believe a word of it. And one of their claims, he says, which I personally find incredible, although others may not, was that while sailing around Libya, they had had the sun on their right-hand side. And that, of course, is precisely the detail that enables us to know that actually the Phoenicians have been telling the truth and that they had crossed the equator, the fact that the sun then started rising on the other side. And so Herodotus, even though he doesn't believe it, has let us know that actually, yeah, the Phoenicians did circumnavigate Africa. He's also, the other thing that's wonderful about him, I listed some of the wonders that he described of India. It's not just India that he writes about, although my favorite of all Herodotian stories is about India, and I'm going to come to that. He describes wonders that sound weird when you read them, but you know, yes, he got that right. One of my favorites is Herodotus is the first author to mention cannabis. So any hippies here, he's with you. And he describes how the Scythians, people who live in what's now sort of Ukraine, Romania, how they grow this plant. And they use it to make clothes, but they also use it for other purposes too. So what the Scythians do, Herodotus tells us, is to take the seeds of a cannabis plant, they crawl in under the blankets of a tent, and they cast the seeds onto glowing stones. As they hit the stones, the seeds flare as though they were incense, and emit a vapor so thick that no steam bath in Greece could possibly compete with it. The effect of this vapor on the Scythians is to make them howl with delight. It's a wonderful, wonderful image. Then there's stuff that's weird, and you read it and you think, oh my God, Herodotus has been on the cannabis here. Where's this coming from? But just possibly there's an explanation for it. And the classic example of this is from India. Herodotus tells us that India is the richest land in the world because of its enormous quantity of gold, which just lies in desert sands. And he also tells us that all the animals, except for horses, he tells us, all the animals in India are of a vastly greater size than anywhere else, which is why, he tells us, the ants in India are midway between dogs and foxes in size, which, of course, I'm sure everyone here will vouch for. And the problem with these huge ants is that they basically guard the gold, because what they do is when they dig down, they throw up the sand, and all the gold dust is scattered in amongst the grains of sand. So how do you get it when you're dealing with huge carnivorous ants? And Herodotus explains that what they do is the Indians harness up camels, and they then go out into the desert with a cunning strategy to get past these terrifying ants. Thus the Indians, with their camels harnessed and themselves equipped in the manner I describe, ride out in search of the gold. And because the ants disappear underground whenever the weather gets too scorching, the prospectors deliberately time their sally to ensure that their actual seizure of the gold coincides with the most blistering spell of heat. Once the Indians, complete with sacks, have arrived at their destination, they fill up their sacks with the sand and then go careering off home as fast as they possibly can. The reason for this, as reported by the Persians, and that's the key thing, as reported by the Persians, is that the ants pick up on their scent and give them chase. Now, there is nothing in the world quite as fast as these ants, Herodotus tells us. So, to the degree that none of the Indians, were they to fail in getting a head start while the ants were massing, would make it back to safety, the male camels, because they are not as fleet-footed as the female ones, start to lag and end up being cut loose one after the other. The females, however, do not slacken, and that, so the Persians say, is how the Indians obtain the greater part of their gold. Well, what to make of that? It may well be that someone told Herodotus this and they enjoyed pulling his leg and Herodotus just swallowed it. But there is another possibility which was suggested by a French anthropologist a few years ago, and if there are any naturalists here with a knowledge of the wildlife of Kashmir, do correct me later if I've got this wrong, but I gather that there is a marmoset in Kashmir, lives on a certain plain, who digs down, and it has been suggested that this is the origin of the story, and that, of course, there are many languages between Kashmir and Greece, and that by a process of Chinese whispers, what in Kashmir, whatever the word was for a marmoset, by the time it came to Greece had been transliterated into the word for ant, and that therefore that explains Herodotus' mistake. And I would like to think that. I don't like to think of Herodotus being made to look stupid by somebody who was preying on his gullibility. I mean, even the keenest Herodotus fan has to admit that there are certain things that, that Herodotus just got straight wrong. For instance, he talks about the possibility discussed among certain Greeks that in the far northwest of Europe, off the continent of Europe, out in the sea, there may be an island. And Herodotus says, well, I've never met anyone who's been there. I don't believe such an island could possibly exist. So that put paid to Britain. Are there any children present? Good. There's one other extraordinary thing that Herodotus has to say about India, and that is that the semen of all Indians is black, and that this is another of the thing that is wondrous about India. Fair to point out that a century later, the great scientist Aristotle fixed on this detail as being completely wrong. And again, the mind slightly boggles because Aristotle was a great one for practical experimentation, and so I'd like to know exactly how he'd... Who knows? Maybe Alexander reported it to him. I don't know. And then there are certain details where the aura of weirdness... You have to put your hands up and say, I have no idea what is going on here, where Herodotus is at. There's an account he gives in Egypt. We know he's gone to Egypt. The detail that he gives is incredibly rich. He's the first person to describe the process of mummification. He gets the names and the identities of the pharaohs who built the Great Pyramid and the other pyramids at Giza correct. An awful lot of what we know about ancient Egypt ultimately derives from Herodotus' accounts. There are stories that he tells us that have been found very recently on papyri dug up from Egyptian rubbish dumps dating from the time that clearly demonstrate that Herodotus is drawing on genuine Egyptian traditions. So we know that he went to Egypt, and we know that he spoke to people there. But he tells us this story that he was taken by an Egyptian to a valley on the border between Egypt and Arabia, and this man told him that every year a huge army of winged snakes fly out of Arabia and try and invade Egypt, and are held at the pass, a bit like the Persians by the Spartans, by ibises. And that if these ibises did not stand and kill all the winged snakes, then Egypt would be overrun by them. And furthermore, Herodotus says, I saw the skeletons of the winged snake. The valley was full of them. And I have no idea what he saw. I mean, sort of part of me wants to think it was, you know, vanished breed of pterodactyls or something. If anyone's got any idea, please do let me know. So you can see why he's been called not just the father of history, but the father of lies. But I cannot emphasize how unfair that is. Because what's astounding about Herodotus is not that he occasionally got things wrong. It's the fact that he got so much right. It's so easy for us now when we can go and look anything up on Google to have a laugh at what Herodotus got wrong. It was easy enough even for people like Aristotle living a century after to take the piss out of Herodotus. But Aristotle and everyone since who has wanted to make sense of the world by recording the vastness of its riches, everyone exists in Herodotus' debt. Because what Herodotus was doing was, he's not just the father of history, he's basically the father of non-fiction. There was nothing he was not interested in. He wrote about the past, yes, but he wrote, as you've seen, about animals, about plants, about geography, about rivers, about customs. There was nothing he was not interested in. And so essentially, today, when we go on the internet and we look at something on Wikipedia or we use the search engine, we are following in Herodotus' footsteps. We all owe him, I think, a huge debt of gratitude. And I cannot urge you enough to, if you haven't read him, to give him a go. He is the most wondrous writer. As I said, he's been my companion throughout my entire life. And if I can persuade any of you to try him and to share just a portion of the pleasure that he has always given me, I will consider this 40 minutes very well spent. Thanks very, very much.
I'm delighted to say that the gods of both the old and the new world are smiling on this session, because we started 5 minutes early, which possibly has to be a record for the Jaipur Literary Festival, I'd say, which means we've got a good time for questions. Please do put your hand up and somebody will come to you. There's a lady there in the front already, and I've got a couple of questions too for you, Tom. Lady first.
Thank you very much. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about Herodotus in his own context. So what would have been the origin of the stories he was telling, and who was his intended audience during his own time?
We know very little, well, we know almost nothing about Herodotus except for what he tells us. And he tells us that he comes from Halicarnassus, which is now the Turkish yachting center of Bodrum. But back in Herodotus' time, it was a Greek colony that nevertheless was full of different people from across what's now southern Turkey, but southern Asia Minor. So Herodotus actually grew up as a subject of the Persian king. And I think that that explains his interest in not just the Persians themselves, but the vastness of this world that they ruled. There is also suggestions within the histories that he was involved in trading to the far west. He's very knowledgeable and interested in Sicily, Carthage, Corsica, Sardinia, and even Spain. And he seems to have a merchant's eye for things that sell. So I suspect that he was involved in sort of the shipping business, and that also woke him up to the infinite fascination of the world. What prompted him to write his history? Well, the context for that was that Herodotus was on that sort of that eastern seaboard of the Mediterranean, the region that the Greeks knew as Ionia, throughout the 6th and then into the 5th century. It had been a kind of smithy for intellectual curiosity of a really outstanding order, and it witnessed the birth of what we call philosophy, of geography, a desire to make sense of the world without necessarily explaining it all in terms of the gods. And what Herodotus does is to apply that methodology to the past, but also, as I said, basically to everything. And I think that explains his kind of, his intellectual roots. That's where he's coming from intellectually. But he's also, I think he would be completely at home at the Jaipur Literary Festival. The Greek world was full, everything in Greece had to be a contest. So they wouldn't just have a literary festival where people just turn up and give talks. There'd have to be a contest. You'd have to vote, people would have to win, people would have to give the best talk. But Herodotus went to these sort of very, very competitive festivals, and he would stood up and clearly he delivered vast chunks of the histories to a listening audience. It's very dramatic. A lot of what he does is very dramatic. So I think that also is a part of the explanation for where he's coming from. He's born into the Persian Empire. He knows he's interested in that. He's aware of the West. He's a highly traveled man. He's incredibly curious. He's from this vibrant intellectual climate, and he exists in a world that is full of literary festivals. What more could you want?
Yeah, there's a gentleman at the front, and then there's one at the back with a blue shirt next. Right at the front here. Oh, okay. You next. Yeah, let's have a youngish person can ask a question then.
Yeah, hello. What Herodotus writes appears largely as fantasy, the tales of dolphins and so on. Why don't we give the credit to Thucydides instead? And in case you really consider Herodotus as the father of history, do you believe the Leopold von Ranke was just repackaging old stuff and selling it under his own name?
Sorry, there was a distortion on the microphone there.
Okay. What Herodotus writes appears largely as fantasy, the tales of dolphins he talks about and so on. Why don't historians nowadays give the credit instead to his disciple Thucydides?
Why did they not give him? Well, I think they do give Herodotus immense credit. Sorry?
Thucydides, I mean. I don't know.
Thucydides. Yes, well, there are two great historians in the 5th century. There's Herodotus, who is basically the fun one, and there's Thucydides, who's the grim one. And I think that sorry, yes, I think that they come in and out of fashion, and Thucydides, for instance, is not really interested in anything except men fighting. So there are no women in it. There's nothing about gold-digging ants. There's nothing about cannabis. There's nothing of that order at all. It's about realpolitik. And that, I think, appeals at certain periods. So during the Cold War, Thucydides seemed like a manual for understanding the timeless nature of political rivalry. The story that Thucydides tells is of the war between the two cities in Greece that had done most to defeat the Persians, Athens and Sparta. Athens being a democracy, Sparta being a sort of rather grim military autocracy. And in the Cold War, that seemed to perfectly reflect the clash between the United States and the Soviet Union. When the Berlin Wall came down and the Cold War ended, suddenly we were in a vastly more pluralist, globalized world where people were suddenly familiar with cultures from other lands in a way that they hadn't been before, and Herodotus seemed suddenly a historian perfectly suited to that. And so I think that thankfully, we live in a more Herodotean age. I think living in a Thucydidean age is fairly frightening. It's better to live in a kind of Herodotean age, a Jaipur literature festival kind of age, than a Thucydidean one.
This gentleman at the back in the blue shirt. At the last session I was at, they were fantastically democratic with their questioners. So they had a gender divide and a divide on whether men had hair or not. So we need either a bald man or a bald woman to ask the next question. But you see, there's a gentleman there standing up with the blue shirt, if you could have the microphone.
I think I'm bolder.
Oh, okay, we've got a bald man. The blue shirt will be next. Well done, sir.
It will be very short. Thank you, Tom, for that passionate account of Herodotus. I wish he could be here and address one of the main questions which is always discussed during this festival. That is the question of the relations or boundaries between fiction and non-fiction. What do you think he would say?
Sorry, I'm finding it very difficult to hear these. What was that?
The boundaries between fiction and non-fiction. What do you think he would say?
I don't think that he would necessarily have recognized that boundary. But I think that I think he felt that certain things were more probable than others. But that if someone told him something, then it wasn't for him to edit it out. So he will put down stories that he clearly thinks are not true and are fantastical. But he regards that as part of his duty. And you know, that's why, for instance, we know that the Phoenicians did indeed go around. I mean, Herodotus regarded that as fiction. But because he'd been told it, he thought, well, okay, well, I'll put it in. And we know that it's not fiction. But as I said, there is a sort of sense in which the histories are kind of the greatest shaggy dog story ever written. And it does have, for me, something of the fascination of a magical realist novel. There are, I mean, it's like something out of South American, this wonderful detail that there is a priestess of Athena who, whenever disaster threatens, grows a beard. It's so great, it's such a wonderful image that whenever, you know, you're in this temple and, oh my God, the priestess has grown a beard. You know that disaster is threatening. That's clearly not true, but I'm so glad that he put it in.
Thanks. You didn't mention anything about translation. I presume that the copy you read when you were 12 was in English. I just wonder, you know, what's different about your translation, your version, and you know, what was wrong with the ones before, and how you found dealing with the original Greek.
So why did I do the translation?
Well, what's different about your translation? What was bad about the previous translation, and how do you go about the art of, you know, translating it from the Greek?
And also, is there anything new in it? I'm interested to know. Did you find anything in the text?
What characterizes your translation as opposed to previous ones?
The balance, obviously, between accessibility and being true to the original language is the tightrope that every translator has to walk. And every translator will have a different understanding of that. So it's my understanding that I bring to this translation. More specifically, I was commissioned to write this for Penguin Classics because Herodotus was one of the very first classics that Penguin published back in the very early 50s, and translations date. I mean, the original Penguin translation is a wonderful one. I've read it many times. My copy is incredibly battered. It's full of grains of sand from Aegean beaches. But when I came to do my own translation, I put it away and didn't look at it because I didn't want to be influenced by it in any way. And having said that, oddly, the thing I think that my translation does that the de Selincourt one didn't is that mine is truer actually to what is said in the Greek. The de Selincourt translation is quite free. I have, at the very least, tried to follow the basic sentence structure throughout. While nevertheless rendering it in English that is contemporary. But having said that, Herodotus in Greek, he has a certain, there are times, his prose is very masterly. There are times where he consciously echoes Homer, for instance, and so where that happens, I've given it a Shakespearean slant. And there are other periods, there are other places where his prose reads very flatly. And again, I've tried to emulate that. He is a great prose stylist, and all I can say is that I've done my best not to be wholly unworthy of articulating for people who don't read Greek the power of his prose. That's all I can say.
We have just a few minutes left, so let's be agonistic. Let's have a competition and see if we can have the shortest questions and one-line answers from Tom. Gentleman at the front first here with a red lanyard on, and then there's a... Oh.
Herodotus is responsible for painting India as this mythical, exotic, ununderstandable world to the West.
Sorry, to the West?
Yeah.
What, so in Britain, or?
Sorry? I said, are you also suggesting that the picture that Herodotus painted about India, this land of mystery, exotic creatures and exotic customs, still persists with the West?
I think, well, I can only speak personally. India was the first country that I came to. I'd never been outside Britain when I landed in what was then Bombay when I was 17. And the reason I wanted to go to that was absolutely that for me, India blazed in my imagination like no other country. And that may well reflect the influence of Herodotus, but it also reflects the enduring fascination that India has for people who live in a damp, wet island, whose imagination obviously is turbocharged by the idea of Mughal palaces and elephants and all the wonders that fill children's books not just in England but across the world. Yes, but I think that Herodotus never went to India, but it's evident that everything that he's told about India he finds completely fascinating. And I think that therefore he is the first example of something that persists right the way up to the present day. Yeah.
Gentleman at the back, Tom, you're breaking the rule. You're answering in longer than one sentence.
Sorry.
You've got to do that with the last two questions.
Was Herodotus involved in any playwriting, and did his contribution make any immediate impact in the general psyche of people at the time, or was it felt more later as people started to look back on what he was doing?
Sorry,
was that Herodotus specifically you were asking?
Yeah, was Herodotus, did he do any playwriting in his time? And I guess it's a two-part question. Was his impact felt immediately in the general public as far as their outlook on the world, or was it felt later as people started to look back on it?
Yeah, or a delayed reaction. Gentlemen, can you just ask your question as well? Then Tom's going to answer both of those in 2 sentences.
Yeah. Curious to know, who do you think is father of Indian history?
Oh, gosh.
2 nice easy ones for the end.
What was the first one? Oh, Herodotus. Yes, I think it had an immediate impact. Hysteria in Greek means inquiries or researches, but a century later it had come to take on the meaning that it has today. So Herodotus essentially defined history for everyone who read it, and even Thucydides, who never mentions Herodotus by name but sort of sneers at him, is clearly massively in his debt. Who the father of Indian history is, I'm not qualified to answer that, and I'll throw it open to the floor.
I have one question for you, and you have to give one-word answer. What is the purpose of history?
To inform and entertain.
Thank you very much, Tom Holland. Thank you all so much for those questions.
Well, thank you for that, Tom Holland and Bettany Hughes, the father of history. I'd like to thank the speakers and request them to accept a small token of our love and appreciation, and also like to thank Hindustan Times for presenting this session to us. The authors would proceed for the book signing, so don't worry. Everybody will get a chance to talk to them, get their names autographed or signed. But right now, this venue will have another event for about half an hour. It's called Right to Laugh.